Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to St John's College to this year's Sydney Ball Lecture. I'm Maggie Snowling and I'm the President of St John's College. And we're very proud as a college to be associated with this lecture. Sydney Ball was one of the most prominent figures of St John's in its modern history. He was elected to a fellowship here in 1882. He went on to be a senior tutor, and I believe that at one point he applied to be president of the college, but his views were considered to be too progressive for the college at the time. Nevertheless, I hope that Sydney Ball has made his mark on Canterbury, on college. He is commemorated in our Canterbury Quad. He was a great innovator, and he firmly believed that the university should be open to the population, which included women and mature learners. And I hope that St John's commitment to access, equality and diversity would find favour with him. So, a warm welcome. It's now my pleasant duty to hand over to Professor Barlow, who's going to introduce this evening's speaker.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I'd like Maggie, to wish you all a very warm welcome to this, our 116th Sydney Ball Memorial Lecture. I've no doubt somebody is going to correct me on that number before the night's out. Bernard, it may be you. You're much better with this sort of thing than me, but we're around about 116th, and we are again holding this wonderful lecture in this amazing lecture theatre that is part of St John's College, and so I just wanted to start by saying a very big thank you to Professor Maggie Snowling for so generously hosting us in this prestigious college. So I'm Jane Barlow. I'm a Professor of Evidence-Based Intervention and Policy Evaluation, and I'm currently Head of Department for DSPI, as we are familiarly known. And it is a particular pleasure to be hosting the Sydney Ball Memorial Lecture this year because, of course, it is our first live, in-person Sydney Ball Lecture since the beginning of the pandemic. And I can't tell you how many hours we spent debating whether that should be the case or not, but we seem to have managed to do something so well done. We're all feeling, I think, a little bit giddy with excitement. I'm hoping that later on we'll all be feeling a little bit giddy with something a little stronger, and I'm that you will all be coming to join us for a reception, drinks reception after the lecture. As many of you will know, the Sydney Ball Memorial Lecture is the DSPI signature event, and it has been running every year since 1917, during which we have been having lectures from a range of luminaries such as John Maynard Keynes, Mrs Sidney Webb, R.H. Tawney, Sir William Beveridge and R.H. Titmuss, to name but a few. However, it probably won't come as a surprise to you that despite Sydney Ball's ambitions to include women, we haven't done amazingly well on that, and that over the 100 years that we've been giving lectures, only 10 of them have been given by a woman. And while our first woman speaker was back in 1927, this of course being the great Beatrice Webb, it took us another 30 years to invite a second woman speaker, after which we were on a roll, and over the next 60 years managed to invite a further 7, thereby increasing the odds from about 1 in 10 to 1 in 6, or improving the odds, I should say. But our speaker today will actually be a first in the sense that she will be our first woman of colour to give the Sydney Ball Memorial Lecture, and that is just a first of many of firsts for her, as you will hear when I introduce her in a moment. Before I introduce this year's speaker, I just wanted to say something very briefly about the Department of Social Policy and Origins. As many of you will know, it has its origins in Barnard House, which was founded in Oxford in 1914, although it wasn't until 30 years after that that we actually became aligned with the university itself. And from its inception, it has been a pioneering body, organisation, and its goal really has been to improve the social and economic conditions of the local community. And I'm very pleased to be able to say that 100 years after its inception, our impact case studies suggest that DSPI research is now making a difference not only to the lives of to the local communities, but also to communities internationally and in the global south. And so we come to this year's speaker, whose concern is, like ours, very much with improving the lives of people across the globe. Baroness Namat Minouche Shafik is a leading economist who was appointed director of the London School of Economics and Political Science in 2017, and is pretty phenomenal really in terms of every aspect of her career, but particularly the way in which she's straddled both public policy and academia. She did her PA at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, her MSc at LSE, and her DPhil here at St Anthony's College in Oxford. By the age of 36, she had become the youngest ever vice president of the World Bank. She then taught at Georgetown University and Wharton Business School before later serving as the permanent secretary of the Department for International Development from 2008 to 2011. The Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund from 2011 to 2014, and as Deputy Governor of the Bank of England from 2014 to 2017, where she sat on all of the monetary, financial and prudential policy committees and was responsible for a balance sheet of over 500 billion. So Minouche has served on chaired indeed in numerous boards, and currently serves as a trustee of the British Museum, the supervisor of board of Siemens, the council of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and the Economy Honours Committee. She was, as you will be aware, made a Dame Commander of the British Empire in the Queen's Birthday Honours List in 2015, and in 2020 she was made a crossbench peer in the House of Lords. She has, of course, written numerous papers that have been published in seminal journals, Oxford Economic Papers, Columbia Journal of World Business, the Middle East Journal, and so on and so forth. She has also co-edited and co-authored a number of books, including Prospects for the Middle East and North African Economies, From Boom to Bust and Back, and Economic Challenges Facing Middle Eastern and North African Countries. But it is for her most recent book, What We Owe Each Other, A New Social Contract for a Better Society, about which Minouche will be talking to us this evening. One reviewer wrote of this, Professor Shafik is an insider turned radical, and another wrote that Minouche Shafik maps out the great challenges of our time and inspires us to rise to them. So Baroness Minouche Shafik, thank you very much indeed for giving the 2021 Sydney Ball Memorial Lecture.
Well, thank you for that exceedingly generous and comprehensive introduction. I'm a little bit ashamed, and I feel like you've set expectations rather high. Let me start by saying a few things about Sydney Ball. And there is no doubt that he was someone deeply rooted in Oxford. Educated at Oriel, a respected tutor and scholar at St John's for decades, and a founder of the Department of Social Policy. I too have my roots in Oxford, where I spent 3 happy years doing my DPhil at St Antony's, and my only regret is that I didn't linger longer. I somehow was in a rush to get out into that so-called real world, not realizing that I'd spent 40 years so far in it. However, there's an even stronger thread and connection between me and Sidney Ball. In addition to his work as a teacher, he was a dedicated progressive reformer and social activist. In fact, he was an early member of the Fabian Society, a collective of intellectuals and activists devoted to achieving and advancing socialist causes in Britain through peaceful and democratic means. He was soon joined in that organization by a number of other prominent figures of the time: the playwright George Bernard Shaw, the educational scholar Graham Wallas, the economist Sidney Webb, and his indomitable wife, the social scientist Beatrice Webb, and among many others who would become instrumental in the creation of the Labour Party in the UK and the British welfare state. But of course, the 4 Fabians that I've just mentioned were also instrumental in creating another institution, the London School of Economics and Political Science, using money bequeathed to the Fabians for that cause. And while the students, faculty, staff, and alumni of LSE encompass every conceivable political viewpoint, those of you who know the school well know that it's a very opinionated place. The idea of a modern university dedicated to rigorous scientific study of government, society, and the economy is undoubtedly part of the Fabian inheritance. And as director of that school, I am, in a manner of speaking, the custodian of that legacy, Sidney Ball's legacy. So it's rather poetic that I am here today to give this lecture in his name. So I'm going to start by outlining the arguments in my recent book, What We Owe Each Other, A New Social Contract. Now, the genesis of this book was really a desire to understand the huge divisions in our society that we see manifested in political polarization, inequality, culture wars, and climate strikes. I wanted to understand, why are people so angry and disappointed in so many countries? Polls show that 4 out of 5 people in China, Europe, India, the United States, and in many developing countries feel the system isn't working for them. And of course, the pandemic compounded that and served as a great revealer as it hit the most vulnerable, the old, the sick, and those in precarious work, the hardest, while exacerbating existing inequalities in our societies. So what were the root causes? What could be done to put our societies back together again? And I increasingly came to the view that the root causes lay in the failings of our social contract. So what do I mean by the social contract? By social contract, I mean the norms and rules that define what we owe each other in society and how we organize the delivery of those obligations to each other. For example, are children raised at home by mothers or grandparents, or does the state provide childcare or paid parental leave so that both parents can stay and work? How much of healthcare is the responsibility of individuals, and how much of it do we pay for collectively through insurance or public funding? Do we expect employers to provide contracts with regular hours and benefits, such as sick leave and pensions, or do we expect workers and their families to carry those risks of illness and old age? In more traditional societies, much of the social contract tends to be delivered by families and the community, and those risks are borne within the family. In more modern societies, the market and the state play a greater role. But in all societies, people are expected to contribute to the common good when they are adults in exchange for being looked after when they're young and when they're old or unable to support themselves. So why do I think the social contract is broken? Well, until the late 20th century, the social contract was built on the premise that families would have a sole male breadwinner and that women would take care of the young and the old for free. There was a presumption that people would stay married until they died and give birth to children in the institution of marriage. They'd have steady employment with a handful of employers over the course of a career, and the education and skills that they accumulated between the age of roughly 6 to their early 20s would be enough to last a lifetime. And most would only have a limited number of years after retirement, and the support they needed in old age would be provided by the women in their families. Now, as I've described that, you're probably sitting there thinking, that bears no relationship to the world I live in. But yet those assumptions still underlie many of the clauses of our current social contract. Today, half of women are employed in the labor market globally, and the upward trend is almost universal. In advanced economies, between a third and a half of marriages end in divorce, and in developing countries, the numbers are rising. A growing proportion of children are born outside of marriage. The average worker doesn't work for 2 or 3 employers in a lifetime. They may work for 2 or 3 employers in a week. And the flexibility of labor markets is only increasing with technological developments. And while many developing countries are still transitioning to getting more workers into formal employment, there are growing signs of informality in the labor markets of advanced economies. We call it the gig economy, but it's really just the informal sector. And climate change, of course, brings massive risks that could disrupt our economies and the sustainability of our societies. I think for me, the biggest disruptors of the social contract have been the changing role of women, which have fundamentally changed the way we raise children and take care of the old, and technology, which has changed work and what we need from our educational systems. I think looking forward, we can anticipate even more disruptions from aging and climate change. Now, let me say something briefly about the difference between the social contract and the welfare state, because there's often confusion between the two. The social contract reflects all the ways that we organize the delivery of collective goods between our families, our communities, our employers, and the state. The welfare state is just one mechanism for delivering those collective goods. So, for example, childcare can be paid for by the state, but it can also just be organized within the family, and that's a choice that society makes as part of its social contract. There's also a common misconception that the welfare state is primarily about redistributing income from the rich to the poor, the so-called Robin Hood function that my colleague at LSE, Nick Barr, refers to. But the main purpose of the welfare state is really what we call the piggy bank function. The important role it plays in redistributing income over our own lives, not between us at any point in time. So a clever child can't go to a bank and ask for a loan to pay for their education and say, I'll pay you back when I get a job. That's what the welfare state does. It finances that child's education and then expects that child to pay taxes later in life to compensate that and fund the education of future children. This first slide shows you the numbers for the UK. At the bottom is age, and the chart shows that, you can see from the bottom, the way we interact with the state at different points in time. And what it shows is that we receive money, we receive support from the state for our education in the early years. We contribute through taxation in the middle years. And then when we get old, we benefit through adult social care and pensions. My LSE colleague John Hills, who we very sadly lost this last year, argued that most people in the UK put as much money into the state as they get out. Now, the wealthy may pay more tax, but they tend to live much longer, and so they benefit through healthcare and pensions far longer than those who are poorer. So let me give some examples of why I think that the current social contract is failing in different areas and what a better model would look like. I'll start with education. Now, humanity has made huge progress in education. This chart just shows you how much more we spend on education across different countries and how we spend it. And the vast majority of countries do most of their spending on primary, secondary, and tertiary level education, usually between the ages of 5 or 6 until people are in their early 20s. Spending on pre-primary, the black bar in this chart, and on adult learning is modest in relative terms in the vast majority of countries, with a few exceptions. Now we know that despite this huge spending in education, we still have huge inequalities in educational outcomes and life outcomes. And we also know that the forces of technology and aging will mean that people will work for far longer and have to change jobs more often. I often tell students at the LSE, you need to be preparing for careers that are going to last 50 or 60 years, not 30 or 40. We also know that from research from places as different as Jamaica and Chicago, that providing extra nutrition to preschool children and supporting parenting skills results in huge improvements in educational outcomes and higher incomes later in life. And we also know that hundreds of studies of adult learning have demonstrated how strong links to employers, early intervention, and sustained funding can keep people in work and contributing to society in the face of economic shocks. So I would argue a better social contract would change the shape of our educational systems to adjust to these new realities. It would invest much more in the early years, when the possibility of equalizing opportunities is the greatest and also incredibly cost effective. And it would invest much more in adult education, where longer careers and technological changes mean reskilling throughout life is essential. Let me look at jobs and employment. One of the most striking things about modern labor markets is that informality, which we used to associate with developing countries, has become a feature everywhere in the world. More workers are on flexible contracts as the labor force has become more diverse and technology has made it possible for firms to outsource more activities. This flexibility has had huge benefits for employers and for consumers, for all of us as consumers. For example, low-budget airlines that employ contract workers have made traveling affordable for millions, for better or worse. For those employed on flexible contracts, they may have jobs that they might otherwise not have had, but with a great deal of insecurity about their incomes, their hours of work, and what happens when they are sick or old. I think a better social contract would retain the benefits of flexibility while providing workers more security in the form of mandatory benefits for all workers, regardless of the nature of their contract, generous unemployment insurance, and opportunities for retraining throughout life. This chart shows how different countries make very different choices about that balance in jobs between flexibility and security. You'll see many advanced economies are in the upper left-hand quadrant, which is associated with highly rigid labor markets with low flexibility and very high levels of security. Many developing countries are in the bottom with what are often called dual labor markets, where you have a small formal sector with high levels of employment protection and low flexibility, and then an informal market which doesn't appear in this chart, where the vast majority work and do not have many protections. I would argue that the sweet spot is the upper right-hand quadrant, where you have high levels of flexibility, and so that employers can let workers go depending on market conditions. But workers are provided with high levels of security. And so that when they are let go, they get generous unemployment insurance, which is close to their previous incomes to maintain their standards of living, and very high levels of investment in reskilling and retraining. This model of so-called flexicurity is very much associated with the Nordic countries, which have very high rates of labor turnover. People lose their jobs all the time. In fact, they have the highest rate of labor turnover in Europe. But it isn't a source of great anxiety, even though people often don't get severance payments and notice periods are often very, very short. Why? Because that flexibility is accompanied by high levels of security in the form of unemployment insurance and retraining, and people very quickly get back into work. So I would argue that a better social contract would adopt more of a flexicurity approach. And that we think, just as in many countries, we've moved to having pension portability, where if you move from one employer to another, you can carry your pension with you. We need to move to a system where we have benefit portability. And so that if you work for 3 employers in a week, each employer contributes a little bit to your sick pay entitlement, your pension, your training requirements, and so on, so that you can continue to grow and develop and have the security that you need in a flexible labor market. Let me turn to the third area that I wanted to highlight, which is intergenerational issues and what a better social contract would look like there. And it seems timely given that COP26 is going on at the moment. Now, in every society, every generation wants to leave the next one better off. And yet, our generation is at risk of leaving future generations with poorer prospects for their livelihoods, a legacy of debt, and a severely damaged planet. This figure shows recent polling around whether people expect their children to be better or worse off than their parents. And what's really striking is how different the results are for advanced and developing countries. In virtually every advanced economy, parents expect their children to be worse off than they are. Whereas in most developing countries, people still have the expectation that the next generation will be better off. Now, the pandemic, of course, disrupted the education of millions of children and resulted in the accumulation of debt levels not seen even higher than what we saw in many cases during the world wars. And there is no doubt that our children will inherit a world which has less biodiversity, which will be hotter, and will carry many more environmental risks for them. And so, what would a better social contract be between the generations? I would argue that we need to invest in the education of young people to enable them to be productive over what will be very long working lives, and that the resulting gains in productivity would help pay for the elderly care needs of an aging population and make debt more sustainable in the future. I think we should give young people an educational endowment for life so that they can adapt to changes in work. And in fact, the current UK government is looking at what a lifetime educational endowment would look like. I think everyone should have access to better reskilling opportunities so that they can contribute to society for longer in working lives that will be much longer. I also think we need to do as much as we can to redress environmental damage and find ways to help reduce the fiscal burden on future generations. And to achieve that, today's older people will need to work longer, and they'll have to link, I think, retirement ages explicitly to life expectancy, alongside measures such as carbon taxation. I think such changes to our social contract would be an enlightened investment by one generation in the next and provide the basis for a new social contract between the generations. So let me now try and draw out some principles that I think should guide us in thinking about the future of the social contract. When Beatrice Webb dissented from the 1909 Royal Commission on the Poor Laws, she argued that a new social contract for the UK should, quote, secure a national minimum of civilized life, open to all, of both sexes and all classes, by which we meant sufficient nourishment and training when young, a living wage when able-bodied, treatment when sick, and a modest but secure livelihood when disabled or aged. In 1927, when she gave the Sydney Ball Lecture under the pseudonym of Mrs. Sidney Webb, she argued that the Poor Laws could not endure because they failed to deliver an adequate social contract. More than 100 years later, I'm not sure she would think that we had lived up to those very simple principles she laid out. So let me try and suggest what principles could apply to create a better social contract today. And the first principle is minimum security for all. I think in every society, it is possible to put a floor on incomes below which no one should go. This can be achieved through cash transfer programs in developing countries, which I worked on for many years when I was at the Department for International Development and at the IMF, or tax credits for low-wage workers in advanced economies, which again exist in many countries. This minimum should include access to healthcare, basic healthcare, and a minimum state pension to avoid destitution in old age. It should also include sick leave and unemployment insurance, regardless of the nature of the employment contract. In developing countries, that means bringing more workers into the formal sector, and in advanced economies, it means mandating that all employers provide benefits to flexible workers in proportion to how much they work. I am not a fan of universal basic income for two reasons. One, I think it's very inefficient in any country that has any capability to target benefits. It seems a bit inefficient to raise tax rates by, let's just say, 20% of GDP, cycle huge resources through the state to reallocate them to many people who don't need it. And so in countries that have the capacity to target, I think earned income tax credits and targeted benefits are better. But the second reason I'm not a fan of universal basic income is because I think it violates a fundamental principle of the social contract in all societies, which is that if you are an able-bodied adult, you're expected to contribute. And I think that principle is an essential part of the social contract in exchange for being looked after when you can't, when you're not able-bodied, or when you're young or old. My second principle is moving to a social contract which has maximum investment in opportunity and capability. In too many places, talent is wasted and opportunities are not provided to all, and disaffection is often greatest in those countries in which the prospects of improving your lot over time has fallen in recent years. This chart shows you what social mobility looks like in different countries. And it asks, how many generations does it take for someone to go from the bottom of the income distribution to the middle? And you can see that in countries like the UK and the US, it takes 5 generations. In Denmark, it takes just 2. In countries like South Africa or Brazil, it takes 9. In those countries, you have no hope in any conscious sense of what you could think about your future offspring, of improving your lot. Now, much of the talent that's wasted in our societies is embedded in women, minority groups, and children who happen to be born in families that are unable to give them opportunities, or in places that are unable to give them opportunities. There's data for the United States which shows that between 1960 and 2010, you could explain 20 to 40% of the productivity gains made in the US economy simply because employers were no longer limited to drawing on a narrow talent pool of white men, because changes in laws and norms meant that they were able to choose from a much broader talent pool that included women and black people. And as a result of that, they were able to match people to the jobs that suited them best. And that improved matching can explain between 20 to 40% of the productivity in the US economy over a 50-year period. Similarly, some very interesting research done at the LSE by my colleague John Van Reenen and others on what they call lost Einsteins, women, minorities, and children from low-income families who happen to be born in poorer families. Happen to be born in poorer families and have the exact same maths and science skills as control groups of children born into wealthier families. If we could get those lost Einsteins to invent to the same degree as white men from high-income families, we could quadruple the rate of innovation and the growth of patents in our economies. So, how can we better use the talent in our societies? Well, I think in addition to investing in the early years, we can also give young people an equal entitlement to education, perhaps with a lifetime endowment to pay for university or vocational training over what will be much longer careers. And while most countries have equalized educational opportunities between boys and girls, women are still disadvantaged in the workplace because globally they do 2 hours more of unpaid work, housework and caring for the young and the old, than men. So more generous parental leave, public funding to support families, and a fairer division of labor at home would mean that female talent is better used in our economies. Let me turn to my third principle, which is sharing risks better. And I'll just move to that. I'm not finished yet. Too many risks in our societies are borne by individuals when they could more efficiently be borne by others or by being managed collectively. For example, it's possible to maintain flexibility for employers to be able to hire and fire workers depending on market conditions if those workers know that they will be protected with unemployment insurance and retraining, as I showed with the flexicurity model. A similar rebalancing of risks needs to occur around childcare, around health and old age. It's not clear, for example, why the costs of maternity leave are usually borne by employers when parental leave paid through general taxation, for example, would create a more level playing field for men and women in the labor market and be less of a burden for firms, especially smaller ones. Similarly, many health risks are more efficiently managed by pooling them across large populations while providing strong incentives for individuals to manage risks around diet and exercise that are key to dealing with the health challenges of the future. Automatic enrollment in pension schemes and insurance for old age care would give individuals more security at the end of their lives. Requiring people to have social care insurance, as countries like Germany and Japan do, is a good way to pool the risks around old age. So those are my three principles: a minimum for all, sharing risks better, and a society which invests much more in capability and using all the talent. Let me just say a few words about the politics of the social contract. So when you look across countries at what kind of political systems deliver better social contracts, there's a clear pattern. Countries that have more inclusive political systems, where there are strong accountability mechanisms, like free and fair elections, free media, tend to have better social contracts. Countries that have more presidential, winner-takes-all political systems tend to have smaller states and less generous social contracts. Countries that are governed by proportional representation tend to provide more support to their citizens because you need broad coalitions and therefore you have to look after more groups in society. And authoritarian regimes facing little accountability have fewer pressures to deliver on a social contract and sometimes simply use the state to enrich themselves and their cronies. I think the pandemic will also be an important factor in the politics of social contracts going forward. I think there's been a survey in 24 countries that looked at people's attitudes before and after the pandemic, and they found that the pandemic has caused people to become more afraid, more hostile, and let down by society. But at the same time, they've made people value human contact more. Look how excited we are all to be together. And value things like social solidarity, equality, community, and self-determination and freedom. There's also evidence that people's attitude to spending has changed. A survey by the IMF in the US found that those who'd experienced serious illness or job loss caused by the pandemic, or who personally knew someone who was, favored a temporary progressive levy or structural progressive tax reform to a greater extent than those who hadn't experienced those things in the pandemic. I also think we need to think a lot about what a new social contract with business would look like. Now, since the 1980s, much of government policy has been focused on maximizing efficiency through the liberalization of trade, privatization, and relaxing regulations on the labor market. Firms have been able to cut costs, reduce benefits, and outsource their supply chains. And shareholders and consumers have benefited from this. But some workers have seen their income stagnate and face greater insecurity in their lives. I think a new social contract with business would have firms paying a fair share of corporate taxes and providing all workers with benefits, while society at large would share more of the risks with firms around minimum incomes, parental leave, pensions, and the development of new skills. It would also be good for business. Being able to rely on the availability of skilled workers, high-quality infrastructure, and a good safety net would reduce their costs and allow them to innovate flexibly. But already there is a huge pressure on firms under the rubric of environmental, social, and governance reforms, ESG, to do this and to behave more responsibly. But I would argue that realizing a new social contract with business will require more than just rhetoric and voluntary measures by a few good corporate citizens. It will require us to make concrete changes to taxation, regulation, and corporate governance. I think a better model would tax business differently. I think the overall burden of taxation can go up or down. I think I'm agnostic on that. But I think the way we organize taxation of business needs to change. Some countries will be able to raise corporate taxes. We've had a secular decline in corporate taxation in the last 20 years in virtually all countries as there has been growing global tax competition. Hopefully, the recent agreements by the G20 under the auspices proposed by the OECD will put a floor on global corporate taxes and reduce the use of tax havens going forward. But I think going forward, we also need to think about how we fund unemployment benefits, pensions, and training costs. If workers are less attached to their employers, then having, for example, they strongly underinvest in training their workers because they feel they will leave. And so maybe that's a cost that needs to be borne by society. And in some countries, they've provided tax incentives, for example, in Austria, to encourage firms to invest more in their employees than they would otherwise. Let me just say a few words about, is all this affordable, since I'm sure that's on your mind. I think it is. I think, first of all, increasingly publicly supported childcare, early years education, and lifelong learning would require more spending, as would achieving universal health care and a minimum state pension. But some of this spending is investment, and that investment will generate future higher tax revenues. Globally, we know, for example, that the average rate of return on investments in education is about 10%. Now, the average rate of return on the S&P 500, the most popular global index of stock markets, has been about 8% over the last 50 years. So education certainly does better. And those investments can therefore sensibly be financed through borrowing, especially in advanced economies. Some of this spending on pensions, for example, and on healthcare will be recurrent and would need to be financed through higher tax revenues. So where would that come from? Well, for one thing, I do think we need to think about a carbon tax. And we can discuss that in the questions. There are many ways to organize a carbon tax, and there are ways to do it which are not regressive, which I think has been one of the criticisms in the past. We also can look at wealth taxes, and many countries have experimented with wealth taxes, whether they are on inheritance, on dividends and capital gains, or on the stock of wealth, which is hard to do. In the UK, for example, we could certainly do with a better system of property taxation through reform of council tax and business tax. Now, I think it's often tempting to invoke the Robin Hood solution and say, let's tax the rich and give money to the poor to fund a new social contract. But I think most countries find that in practice, measures that fundamentally change and equalize the distribution of opportunities are far more powerful than anything the state can do in the form of redistribution retroactively. And I think that's a very big theme in my book. So-called pre-distribution policies, such as equalizing access to good education or providing additional investment in deprived communities, are far more empowering to the individuals and reduce the risk of chronic dependency on state support. So this investment, this principle of investing in capability and opportunity and pre-distribution, I think is quite important. The more redistribution you have to do, the more your pre-distribution policies have failed. So let me close with on realizing a social contract. I would argue that a new social contract is not about higher taxes, more redistribution, and a bigger welfare state. It's actually about a fundamental reordering and equalizing of the distribution of opportunities and security in our societies. The result would be higher productivity and the possibility to more efficiently share the risks around childcare, health, work, and old age that are so much at the source of current anxieties in our societies. Financing such a reordering requires rebalancing the relative taxation of capital, which I think is taxed too little, relative to labor, which most countries tax too much, introducing taxes on things that we want less of, like carbon or smoking, and investing more in education and greening our economy. I would argue we owe each other more than our current social contract can deliver. A bit less emphasis on me, a bit more emphasis on the benefits of we. A new social contract is possible that gives everyone a decent life, shares risks more humanely, and draws on everyone's talents. I think a better architecture of security and opportunity would be based on 3 principles: providing minimum security for all, maximizing investment in human capability, and sharing risks more efficiently and equitably. I think those principles provide the foundation for a society that recognizes our interdependence, enables everyone to fulfill their potential, and asks everyone to contribute as much as they can for as long as they can for our common good. Thank you very much.